A very warm welcome indeed to today's Reform Policy Summit, 21st Century Connectivity Lessons for the UK. My name is Andrew Hortonby and I'm Director of Reform, which is an independent, non-party think tank whose mission is to find a better way to deliver public services and economic prosperity in the UK.
So what's our top line conclusion? Well, so we're predicting that growth in terms of IP traffic in the UK will be 27% on average per year between 2014 and 2019. So that's a near tripling of network growth. So that's pretty huge. Let's look at more detail. So not many more people relative to current population are going to be added in the UK. However, we're going to see a near doubling of devices from 318 million to 615 million. So, what are our conclusions? Rising demand for video, many more connected devices, increasing network complexity. Consumers are going to want to have more connectivity on every platform, wherever they go. And so we need to manage for complexity, as well as that really important point about capacity and congestion. Thank you.
The first thing we should observe is that networks are starting to do stuff we didn't expect. And as the IoT drifts out, we will see unusual behaviors. We are now in the business of designing and implementing networks that are going to have to cope with things that we don't know about. So here are the leaders and laggers. By the way, London is the furthest right on this graph, right at the bottom. We have on the left, the world leaders, gigabit both ways, 10 if you want it, it's symmetric, it's fiber, it does what it says on the tin. On the far right-hand side, you've got asymmetric services, and it tends to focus on words like up to and homes passed, as opposed to actually delivered and homes connected, or indeed offices connected. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you that I have been involved in this debate since 1986, and I have seen every dumb argument I can think of for not putting fibre to the home. I think there is now sufficient evidence to say it ain't that difficult. Everybody else is doing it. We are going to get left behind. Thank you very much.
So what do the businesses want? Let's get the basics right first and foremost. Make sure that what you're being sold is what you are actually delivered. The second is upgrading, when we talk about national strategy, like the Obama example, upgrade our targets and our aspirations. When government talks about ultra-fast being, 30 megabits plus, when we've got, as Peter was saying, cities delivering one gigabit up and down, is completely silly. We need to be talking about much higher aspirations. Government needs to make a bigger commitment as well, and one of the biggest things that we've asked for in the spending review is that as cuts move forward, one of the things that actually needs to be increased is consideration of digital as part of our core national infrastructure.
We started hyperoptic in 2011. We deliver 1 gig symmetric services in the UK. What we find, surprisingly, and against any business plan we originally put together, is about 20% of people actually take the gig product. And I think that's really interesting. In a model where you have other companies saying that people actually don't need those speeds. I think in the world of tomorrow, that line between people going at 9 o'clock in the morning to the office, leaving at 6 o'clock, all of that's going to change. Because there's no particular reason when you have virtual reality, when you have fantastic speeds at home, when you have the ability to communicate with people all over the world and create teams in a virtual sense, you're not required to only keep those working hours. And people who want to get involved in the workforce on a part-time basis or off-hour basis now can add to the productivity of the country, and that's what excites me.
Well, the question in my mind is, do we want to be number one amongst all the lame ducks of Europe? Or do we want to actually be out there competing with the best of the world? Competition's not in Europe. The competition is in Southeast Asia and North America.
So let's start with a quick précis of where we are and where we're heading. So we finished fibre to the cabinet to around 84% at the time of the last Rugby World Cup in 2011. And at the same time, Chorus demerged out of Telecom New Zealand, and Telecom is now rebranded as Spark. So fibre to the home is around halfway rolled out in New Zealand under a 75% plan to 2020, with Chorus doing the lion's share of that. There was a tender process, for those who don't know, to extend that, and there's a number of rural initiatives underway as well. Following a nationwide competition, Dunedin is the first gigabit city in the Southern Hemisphere. So where does it take us? Again, on the whistle stop, we are charging up the OECD rankings. We've moved past the average for fibre to the home coverage. VDSL is in the top 10 of OECD countries. Roughly 2 out of every 3 homes can get VDSL. So the demerger, I think it's really important that everybody understands, was a choice, clearly against the backdrop of a government-announced promise around ultra-fast broadband and a competitive tender process for that. In September 2011, when the company put that to shareholders, there was an independent expert report that said there would be 3 main benefits, and I thought that might be of interest to you here. Greater financial flexibility to exploit growth opportunities and manage capital structures, possible higher aggregate market share valuations. Chorus could be compared with other infrastructure entities trading at higher multiples, and relief from regulation. And on that, I'd note that Spark is largely unregulated, and the complexity of the 3-box operational separation model was removed, and that was the context for New Zealand at the time. In New Zealand, a public-private partnership has retained the benefits of commercial disciplines, and I think this has ensured and assisted efficiency and innovation. I can't imagine having done the demerger that we did in a year if we had not chosen to do it. So I think it's a big decision, and the incumbent has to be involved if it's made. And lastly, of course, a fit-for-purpose regulatory framework with what you're trying to achieve is a very, very good idea. Thank you.
So we provide an open and operator-neutral infrastructure in order to secure competition on the service level. And thereby we're creating a level play field for all the service providers and operators in the city of Stockholm. When we started 20 years ago, we couldn't think of the use of this network. No, not anyone. We put down 96 fiber cables, and people said that, what should you use all that fiber to? Now we're putting down 1,000 fiber cables. So the demand for dark fiber has exceeded all our expectations. We have over 100 operators and service providers in our networks. And there's small ones, there are big ones. What we see in Sweden is that if you have fiber connection, more than 68% of that have that fiber connection that subscribes to 100 megabit bandwidth or more. We see that the fiber is the killer application. If you got fiber, then you got innovation, then you get the needs. Experiences from the city of Stockholm, as we see it. We have two main objectives, and it would be for Europe to be competitive in a natural environment. First of all, we see fiber that is future-proof, because, and also in the earlier panel you talked about that you had to be symmetric. Of course, it had to be symmetric connections for many, many needs, and not at least for telemedicine and that kind of needs. The second thing is to get it built. But the third thing that's very, very important is not only to get it built, but to get it built in a way that secure competition on the service level.
Now, here we have been hearing that basically G.fast was the holy grail. It was the thing that was going to make the copper network work forever and deliver what we need. I wanted to share a few points with you about G.fast. Top theoretical speeds of 500 megabits per second in a laboratory will only be available with G.fast for those who are extremely close to the node. And the speeds are going to drop very fast from there. This is actually a very important point and something that I don't think a lot of people realize if we're talking about nation building. quality of service predictability is not something we can expect to have with GFAST. Why is this important? I tried to visualize this, the predictable versus the unpredictable. If you deploy fiber to the premises, basically for 80% plus of households, you will know, anyone who wants to offer services will know what these households can get in terms of quality of service. And then on the outer edges, you will have less predictable bandwidth and latency and all of these elements. If you look at copper enhancement technologies, what you will get is this. Someone talked about Swiss cheese. It's actually more complex than Swiss cheese because there's different levels of holes. Basically, for 100% of the network, you will not be able to anticipate what the end user has. Fiber is not expensive. And when I say fiber, I mean FTTP. It's not expensive. Expensive is the absolute wrong word to talk about this. Why? Because the investment cost is not the issue. The investment case is the issue. And it's the issue because we have been expecting companies whose market outlook is to have 3 to 5 year profitability on anything they invest in, to invest in networks that are only going to deliver value in 10 to 15 years. That disconnect is what creates the issue. And I would argue that public subsidies, and this is not a lesson to the UK, it's a lesson to every country in the world that's put public subsidies on the table for this. Public subsidies have not made an unviable business case viable. Public subsidies have allowed non-infrastructure companies to consider infrastructure business cases. If you're looking for a solution to get the outcome of a sustainable national infrastructure in telecoms without or with minimal public funding, it seems to me that structural separation should be considered as a viable mechanism.
Yeah, so my name is Maurice Patrick, I work at Barclays. Many of the incumbents in Europe would argue that by having an anchor tenant on the fibre network, it can stimulate higher investment because you have a higher guarantee of the demand and usage there of the network. So thoughts on the panel on that would be grateful.
I'm hearing that language around a lot, and I guess I don't really have an answer for you. But we haven't had any issues of business falling away post-separation.
I mean, my simple answer to that would be, well, how much more awesome would it be to have 4 anchor tenants? And I mean, essentially, if you structurally separate, the service entity is not going to go to another network to deliver services, so it's still going to be an anchor tenant. And the other guys will also move to that new network, and therefore usage of assets will be considerably higher.
Skilled workers and small, medium-sized companies are internationally mobile. Therefore, it's very important to actually focus on what you need to keep them here in the UK or to attract others to here in the UK. And connectivity is one of the buzzwords. Connectivity can have many different aspects to it. Transport or communications being 2 key aspects. And in some areas, it's the same issues. It's about speed, it's about cost, it's about availability. The European Commission's Digital Agenda project recently came out with an assessment of the EU. And I think part of the challenge, in my view, is that here in the UK, we tend to be too obsessed by the EU. We tend to always look at that for comparisons, whereas when you look at what's happening at a city level, it's new players, particularly in the East, that are really setting the world alight. But during the recession and recovery, what happened in London was sentiment started to change about London in terms of its connectivity. The feeling a few years ago was that London was pretty good. The way I would describe it, it's like a barbell. The hot area was the city, hence everyone thought this is the key cluster, this is where connectivity is top of the tree. But what we also found is as more people started to be self-employed or small firms started to crop up, they were working in other areas and they started to complain, naturally, to their representatives, whether at the GLA or elsewhere. And then research was done to show that many areas in London were actually not that good on connectivity. At a national level, though, I would say the 4 I's are the key issue. Investment, innovation, infrastructure, and incentives. Investment in the UK is not particularly high when you look at international comparisons. This is as an economy as a whole. Innovation is quite good, but we don't always bring it to market. Infrastructure spending is quite low, and therefore you need to incentivise the private sector.
My name's Robert Wall. I work for the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which does exactly what it says. So we invest on behalf of 18 million Canadian contributors and beneficiaries, helping them create their financial stability in retirement. The fund itself stands at 270 billion Canadian dollars today. That makes it a large fund, but it's also growing. It'll be 500 billion Canadian dollars by 2030. So what do we look for in our infrastructure investments? I think it's quite simple. We look for large-scale investments. We invest a minimum of 500 million sterling in any one transaction. So we have also looked globally at telecommunications infrastructure and have already had a number of the cases that we've been involved with spoken directly about some of the other panel members. We considered an investment in Singapore in the ducts and manholes that support the next generation network there. We have seen the thriving independent fibre to the premise network owners and operators in the Netherlands and have looked to make investments in that jurisdiction. We've seen firsthand the damage that public participation in the national broadband network in Australia has done as a major owner of telecommunications infrastructure in that country as well. And we've watched with some envy the example that Vanessa spoke to in New Zealand. And from these experiences, and consistent with our strategy, we think that independent ownership of core networks can be beneficial to a broad set of stakeholders.
We think that the current situation in the UK market has got some risks for investors, and there are a lot of myths of how the UK is doing, which we think need to be debunked for investors in the UK to understand what risks they're taking. I think this is the most important slide. We've talked about this already in previous presentations. It depends how you define speed. If the definition is anything above 30 megabits per second, the UK does quite well. If you look at higher speeds or fibre to the home, we do extremely poorly. And in the House of Lords Select Committee chart on the right, we're just above Minsk, which I don't think is where we want to be. VDSL, however, has been very cheap. There's no sign in the Openreach capex of the £3 billion that BT claims has been spent. It's very, very flat. And group capex has come down, while BT UK subsidies are going up. So I think it's very important to note that the money is not going in to the networks in the UK right now. And it may be that cheap upgrades can work, but I would say that possibly that's a risky strategy. I think what's also very important to note is that Openreach makes a huge amount of money. The reason for that is that the regulated asset base is not based on current spend, it's based on what it would cost to build a new network, except of course that new network is not being built. 30 years after privatization, we've recreated a monopoly with BTEE that controls 2/3 of the cash flow in the telecoms market. Telecoms is a scale business. It's very hard to compete against that. Separation would create the pie on the bottom right, which would create a far more competitive and even market.
I think Sky has three perspectives that may be of use to you. We are firmly on the challenger side of the equation, and our bias, to the extent we have one, is that we should be moving as a nation, as an industry, and ultimately ourselves as a provider to gigabit broadband for the UK. So finally, how do we think that you can mobilise investment? We think the answer is clear. An independent Openreach spun out to shareholders in a process that is exactly analogous to that when BT itself spun out O2, its mobile operator. All of those same issues show that it can be done when there is the will to do so. That company would be a FTSE 100 company. And I think we've heard from both Robert and Nick this morning that should lay to rest any doubts about the ability of that company to attract capital to make the investment that the UK needs in faster broadband infrastructure.
"20 years ago, there was a really clear focus on regulation here in the UK on driving change through competition, dealing with incumbent fixed operators, facilitating entry of mobile operators, and increasing competition across a range of markets. At the moment, the regulatory system has evolved in ways that really plays into the hands of incumbents. On top of that, the regulation and the regulatory debate lacks a clear focus now on competition. We have incumbents arguing for state-based solutions rather than market-based solutions, and sometimes they're succeeding. So what should we do about this? Well, I think I'm going to focus on two things, but dwell mostly on the second. I think the first is to try and put competition clearly back at the center of our regulatory system. First, there's abundant evidence that competition delivers. We see it delivering in lots of other markets, from low-cost airlines to pay TV, and lots of these have similar issues in terms of upstream infrastructure and downstream service provision. Secondly, we do need to challenge arguments about the necessity of monopoly, whether it's the anchor tenant argument or other arguments. I think that Ofcom faces a really critical moment, not just for the country, but also for Ofcom. The fixed line is still probably one of the worst bottlenecks in monopoly there, whatever you call it, but the strong position BT is one of the biggest bottlenecks in the country. And it's still a huge bottleneck after 20 years. And if it's not solved, it's going to look like a failure of the regulatory system as a whole to deal with what it was originally set up to do, which is breaking up a state-owned monopoly and trying to get a competitive telecom market. Vertically integrated players have an incentive and ability to favor their own downstream operations. BT's overall spend on access networks is flat, and so the much publicized expenditure on NGA has come at the expense of investments in non-GEA lines. You start regulating price, then you have to regulate something else, then you have to regulate quality. And this is where Ofgem went. And if Ofcom thinks it can fix the open reach problem by regulating more, it should just look at what Ofgem did and the mistakes Ofgem made and learn lessons from that. The test for reference to the Competition and Markets Authority is so clearly met with this issue. The test is, are there likely to be adverse effects on competition? Would a reference to the Competition Commission or CMA be proportionate to those? Is there availability of available remedies? And is that the appropriate forum to do it? And I think those issues are met in spades. So I think in addition to changing the regulatory system to make it more pro-competition and less pro-incumbent, Ofcom really needs to make sure that it doesn't dodge this issue. My final point would be that a really easy solution for everybody would be what happened in New Zealand, for BT to wake up and work out that actually it might be in its and everybody else's best interest to do this voluntarily. Thank you very much.